The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds of the lake house, cutting golden strips across the oak table where Caroline and I used to share our coffee. I sat alone now, same chair, same mug, the blue ceramic one with the tiny chip on the handle that she'd refused to throw away. "It gives it character," she'd say, running her thumb over the imperfection the way she did with everything broken that still had use left in it. I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain and looked out at Clearview Lake. The water was mirror still, reflecting the October sky like polished steel. Caroline had chosen this place 32 years ago, walking through rooms that smelled of sawdust and possibility. "This is where we'll grow old," she'd announced, as if the decision had been made by something larger than either of us. She'd been right, of course. We had grown old here. I just hadn't expected to finish the job alone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note echoing through rooms that felt too large for one person. I'd built most of the furniture myself back when my hands were steadier, and my back didn't remind me of every ladder I'd climbed, every beam I'd lifted. The dining room table where we'd hosted Christmas dinners, the built-in bookshelves where Caroline arranged her mysteries and gardening magazines in perfect rows, the bay window seat where she'd curl up with her knitting, needles clicking in rhythm with the rain. Everything here carried her fingerprints, her choices, her laughter. Even 3 years after the funeral, I sometimes caught myself setting 2 cups on the counter before remembering. The gravel driveway crunched under tires, a sound I'd grown to recognize from any room in the house. But this engine was unfamiliar, newer, with the quiet hum of something expensive. I moved to the window and saw a black SUV pulling up beside my old Ford. The driver's door opened, and out stepped my son. Ethan looked prosperous. That was the word Caroline would have used. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly pressed, the kind that costs more than I used to spend on clothes in a year. His hair was shorter than I remembered, touched with silver at the temples, that made him look distinguished rather than aging. He moved with the confident stride of a man who expected doors to open for him. I hadn't seen him in 8 months, not since that stilted phone call where he'd mentioned needing some space to figure things out with Madison. I'd respected that space, maybe more than I should have. Caroline had always been the bridge between us, translating my practical silences into words Ethan could understand, and his restless ambitions into something I could accept. Without her, we'd defaulted to the awkward politeness of distant relatives. A car door slammed, then another. A woman emerged from the passenger side, Madison, my daughter-in-law, though she'd never seemed comfortable with that title. She wore a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her blonde hair swept back in one of those casual styles that takes an hour to achieve. Behind her, 2 older figures unfolded from the back seat. I recognized them from the wedding photos that still sat on Caroline's dresser. Gerald and Patricia Monroe, Madison's parents. The 4 of them stood in my driveway like a delegation. Gerald adjusted his sport coat and surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of a man appraising real estate. Patricia clutched a leather handbag and whispered something to Madison that made my daughter-in-law nod with satisfaction. I opened the front door before they could knock. Old habits from my construction days. Better to meet trouble on your own terms than wait for it to find you. "Dad?" Ethan's smile was bright and brittle. "You look good." "Ethan." I stepped back to let them pass. "Madison, Mr. and Mrs. Monroe." Gerald's handshake was firm, aggressive. Patricia offered her cheek for an air kiss I didn't give. Madison smiled with her mouth, but not her eyes. The hallway suddenly felt crowded, filled with perfume and aftershave, and the particular tension that comes when people want something they haven't asked for yet. "Coffee," I offered, because Caroline had trained me to be a host, even when I didn't feel like one. "This won't take long," Ethan said, which should have been my first warning. We gathered in the living room, them on the sofa Caroline had reupholstered in soft green fabric, me in my reading chair with its view of the lake. Gerald's eyes roamed the room, taking inventory. He lingered on the stone fireplace I'd built by hand, the custom-built entertainment center, the hardwood floors Caroline and I had refinished together one humid summer. "Beautiful place," Patricia said, but her tone suggested she was already planning changes. "It was Caroline's vision," I said. She had ideas about everything, down to which trees to plant so they had framed the view just right. Madison shifted uncomfortably. She'd never known how to respond when I mentioned Caroline. Some people freeze when confronted with grief, as if death might be contagious. "That's actually what we wanted to talk about," Ethan said. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, the posture of a man delivering important news. The future of this place. I waited. In construction, you learn that silence is often more powerful than words. People will fill quiet spaces with more truth than they intended to share. Madison's parents need a place to live, Ethan continued. Their lease is up next month, and with Dad's retirement, he gestured toward Gerald, who nodded gravely, as if confirming a tragedy. We've been looking at senior communities, Gerald said, but the good ones have waiting lists. And the costs. He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Their family, Madison added, her voice soft but insistent. And this house has so much space. More than you need, really. The words hung in the air like smoke. I could feel them waiting for my response, watching my face for signs of weakness or compliance. But I had spent 40 years managing construction crews, negotiating with contractors, staring down building inspectors who thought they could intimidate an old man with a clipboard. My expression didn't change. I see, I said finally. We thought, Ethan said, speaking faster now, maybe it would be good for you, too. All this space, all these memories. It might be time to downsize, move somewhere more manageable. Somewhere more manageable, I repeated. There's a nice senior community in Clearwater, Patricia offered brightly. Garden apartments, meal service, activities. You'd have people your own age to socialize with. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The boy who had learned to fish from this dock, who'd helped me build the tire swing that still hung from the old oak tree, who'd brought Caroline wildflowers from the meadow behind the house every Mother's Day until he left for college. That boy was gone, replaced by this stranger in an expensive suit who spoke about my life as if it were a problem to be solved. And if I don't want to move, I asked. The question caught them off guard. Gerald and Patricia exchanged glances. Madison's smile faltered. Ethan's jaw tightened in a way I remembered from his teenage years, when he'd been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. Dad, he said, his voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a child. Be reasonable. You're 73 years old. This house is too big, too isolated. What if you fall? What if something happens? What if it does? We worry about you, Madison said, though she'd never shown any evidence of worry before. Living out here alone, with your heart condition? My heart condition is managed. Still, Ethan said, wouldn't it be nice to have people around? To not have to worry about maintenance, yard work, all the things that get harder as we get older? I stood and walked to the window that faced the lake. The morning mist was burning off, revealing the water in all its October glory. Caroline's garden was still blooming, the late roses she'd babied through 15 summers. The Japanese maples she'd planted to turn brilliant red this time of year. The dock where we'd sat countless evenings, watching the sun set behind the pines. This house isn't just a house, Stoll, I said without turning around. It's Caroline's legacy. It's where we built our life together. She's gone, Dad. Ethan's voice was gentler now, but the words still cut. She's been gone for 3 years. Holding on to this place isn't going to bring her back. I turned to face them, 4 pairs of eyes watching me, waiting for me to crumble, to accept their logic, to make their lives easier by sacrificing my own. The house stays with me, I said quietly. Gerald leaned forward. Richard, let's be practical about this. The upkeep alone must be... The house stays with me, I repeated. Dad? Ethan stood, running a hand through his silver hair. We're trying to help you. Can't you see that? Help me what? Give up everything I've worked for? Everything Caroline and I built together? Move on, Madison said sharply. That's what normal people do. They move on. The room went silent. Even Patricia looked uncomfortable with the naked honesty of it. But Madison had said what they were all thinking, that my grief was inconvenient, my attachment to this place unreasonable, my refusal to accommodate their plans selfish. I appreciate your concern, I said, though appreciation was the furthest thing from what I felt. But this is my home. It will remain my home until I decide otherwise. Ethan's face flushed. And what about family? What about helping people when they need it? You mean the family that visits twice a year? The family that calls on holidays and birthdays if they remember? That's not fair. Isn't it? I looked at each of them in turn. When did you last ask how I was doing? Not what I could do for you, but how I was managing? When did you last visit just to spend time together? No one answered. I thought so, I said. The silence stretched until Gerald cleared his throat. Perhaps we should take some time to think about this. Explore other options. There are no other options, Patricia said, her mask of politeness finally slipping. We've looked everywhere. This is the only place that makes sense. For you, I said, not for me. I watched them file out, their confident demeanor replaced by something between frustration and disbelief. They'd come here expecting compliance, maybe even gratitude. Instead, they'd found resistance from a man they'd assumed would roll over. As the black SUV disappeared down the driveway, I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat back down at the kitchen table. The house felt different now, not empty, but alert, as if it too understood that something had shifted. I thought about Caroline, about what she would have said if she'd been sitting across from me during that conversation. She'd had a way of seeing through people's motivations, of understanding the difference between genuine concern and self-serving manipulation. They don't want to help, I said aloud to the empty room. They want to take. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, marking another hour in what I now understood would be a much longer fight. Because this wasn't over. In my construction days, I'd learned to read the signs when a project was about to go sideways. The too quick smiles, the rehearsed explanations, the way people avoided direct eye contact when they were about to screw you over. I'd seen all those signs today. I reached for the notepad Caroline always kept by the phone, the one where she'd jot down grocery lists and appointment reminders. At the top of a fresh page, I wrote 3 words that would change everything. Time to fight back. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The real confrontation is just beginning, and what happens next will show you exactly what a determined father can do when his back is against the wall. The silence after they left felt different from my usual solitude. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a man who'd chosen to be alone with his memories. It was the hollow echo of something breaking. I sat in my chair for a long time after the SUV disappeared, watching the lake change color as clouds drifted across the sun. The water went from mirror bright to pewter gray to deep blue, the way it had every day for 32 years, indifferent to human drama. Finally, I stood and began the ritual of straightening up, though there wasn't much to straighten. 4 coffee cups that had gone unused, cushions that needed refluffing where unwelcome visitors had sat. I carried the cups to the kitchen and washed them by hand, the way Caroline had taught me. The dishwasher's for big messes, she'd say. These little things deserve personal attention. Personal attention. When had I stopped giving Ethan that? The question followed me as I moved through the house, checking windows, adjusting the thermostat, performing the small acts of maintenance that filled my days. In the hallway, I paused before the gallery wall Caroline had created. 3 decades of family photographs arranged with her artist's eye for balance and story. There was Ethan at 2, chocolate cake smeared across his face at his birthday party. At 7, missing his front teeth but grinning as he held up the base he'd caught off our dock. At 16, lanky and serious in his baseball uniform, the one season he'd played before deciding sports weren't his thing. At 25, nervous and proud in his wedding tuxedo, Madison radiant beside him in her grandmother's dress. I studied that last photo, looking for clues I'd missed at the time. Had there been warning signs? Had Madison's smile been too practiced, too aware of the camera? Had Ethan's hand on her waist been possessive rather than protective? Or was I reading the present into the past, looking for explanations that weren't there? The truth was simpler and more painful. People changed. The boy who'd spent summer afternoons helping me rebuild the dock, who'd listened with genuine interest as I explained the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver, who would ask for bedtime stories about the houses I'd built. That boy had grown into a man I barely recognized. When had it started? I traced the timeline backwards, looking for the moment when concern became condescension, when love became obligation. Maybe it was college, when Ethan discovered there was a world beyond Clearview Lake. One where fathers were measured not by the calluses on their hands, but by the numbers in their bank accounts. Maybe it was his first job in the city, where success meant corner offices and client dinners and a lifestyle that required explanations I couldn't provide. Or maybe it was Caroline's diagnosis. The memory hit me like a physical blow. 4 years ago, autumn like this one, when the doctors had used words like aggressive and metastatic and palliative care with the casual precision of carpenters discussing wood grain. Caroline had taken the news with characteristic grace, already planning how to spend whatever time remained. But Ethan had looked at me as if I'd somehow failed him, as if a better father would have prevented this, would have found a way to keep death from touching our family. I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at Caroline's garden. She'd spent her last good months there, planting bulbs she'd never see bloom, tending roses she'd never smell again. "Promise me you'll keep it going," she'd whispered during one of those endless hospital nights. "Promise me something beautiful will still grow here." I'd promised, and I'd kept that promise, teaching myself the difference between annuals and perennials, learning which plants needed deadheading and which should be left alone. The garden still bloomed every spring, a riot of color and fragrance that Caroline had orchestrated from her hospital bed. But Ethan had never asked about it, had never noticed the way I'd preserved every corner exactly as she'd designed it. After the funeral, something had shifted between us. The shared grief I'd expected never materialized. Instead, Ethan had thrown himself into work, into his marriage, into anything that didn't require him to sit with sadness. And I'd retreated into this house, into routines that kept Caroline's presence alive, into a solitude that felt safer than risking more loss. We'd become strangers who shared a name and a history, but no common language for what came next. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. For a wild moment, I hoped it might be Ethan calling to apologize, to say he'd been wrong, to ask if we could try again. But the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Dalton, this is Patricia Monroe." I should have hung up. Instead, I found myself saying, "Mrs. Monroe." I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to getting her way through persistence rather than charm. I wanted to follow up on our conversation this morning. There's nothing to follow up on. I think there might be. You see, Richard, may I call you Richard? I understand this is difficult. Change always is, especially for people of our generation. Our generation. As if we were peers, as if her 70-odd years somehow gave her the right to speak for mine. But sometimes, she continued, what feels like loss is actually opportunity, freedom, a chance to discover what comes next. I've discovered what comes next, I said. It's staying right here, in this big empty house. Richard, be honest with yourself. When was the last time you used the guest bedrooms? The formal dining room, the study? You're rattling around in all that space like a man who's forgotten how to live. The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. I did rattle around sometimes, moving from room to room like a ghost haunting his own life. There were spaces I barely entered anymore. Caroline's sewing room, where her half-finished quilt still waited on the cutting table. The guest bedrooms we'd prepared so hopefully for grandchildren who'd never materialized. The study where I used to pay bills and plan home improvement projects that no longer seemed necessary. But emptiness wasn't the same as purposelessness. This house held 32 years of marriage, 3 years of mourning, and a lifetime of memories that couldn't be measured in square footage. "Mrs. Monroe," I said, "with all due respect, you don't know me well enough to tell me how to live." "No, but I know Ethan, and I know how much he worries about you. We all do." Ethan worried enough to visit twice in the past year. If that's his definition of concern, I'm not impressed. Silence stretched across the line. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had lost its practiced warmth. "You're being selfish, Richard. Family means compromise. It means putting the needs of the group ahead of your own wants." "Whose family? Yours or mine? We're all family now. That's what marriage means." "Marriage," I said slowly, "means a lot of things. But it doesn't mean one family gets to absorb another like a hostile takeover." I hung up and immediately unplugged the phone from the wall. The sudden silence was profound, almost sacred. Outside, a red-winged blackbird landed on the feeder Caroline had hung from the oak tree. It pecked at the seeds I'd refilled that morning, then flew away, leaving the feeder swaying in the October breeze. The afternoon passed slowly. I tried to read, but the words swam on the page. I tried to watch television, but nothing held my attention. Finally, I went to the garage and pulled out my tools, spreading them on the workbench Caroline had bought me for our 20th anniversary. The familiar weight of the hammer, the precise edges of the chisels, the satisfying click of the tape measure, these things still made sense when nothing else did. I found a piece of oak I'd been saving for the right project and began to plane it smooth, losing myself in the rhythm of the work. Wood didn't lie. It didn't manipulate or cajole or guilt you into doing things you didn't want to do. It simply was what it was, revealing its true nature only under careful, patient attention. As the shavings curled away from the blade, I thought about Ethan's childhood visits to this same garage. How he'd stand on a step stool, tongue poking out in concentration as he helped me sand a board or hold a piece steady while I measured. How his eyes had lit up when I'd let him use the drill press for the first time, his small hands steady under my guidance. "Why do you build things, Dad?" he'd asked once, maybe 8 years old, covered in sawdust from head to toe. "Because building something that lasts feels good," I'd told him. "Because when you make something with your hands, you put a piece of yourself into it. Long after you're gone, that piece remains." He'd nodded solemnly, as if filing away wisdom for future use. But somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that lesson. Or maybe he'd learned a different one, that things built by hand could be dismissed, discarded, sold off when they became inconvenient. The light was fading when I finally put away my tools. I'd accomplished nothing productive, had simply moved wood shavings from one place to another, but my hands felt steadier, my breathing calmer. Sometimes the point wasn't accomplishment. Sometimes it was just the reminder that you still had purpose, still had skills that mattered. I made myself a simple dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that tasted like childhood. Caroline would have added herbs to the soup, maybe a side salad to balance the richness of the cheese. But Caroline wasn't here, and I was learning to be okay with simple things done simply. As darkness settled over the lake, I sat in my chair with a cup of coffee, watching the lights of distant houses flicker on across the water. Other families were settling in for the evening, children doing homework at kitchen tables, couples discussing their days, grandparents reading bedtime stories over video calls with faraway grandchildren. I wondered what Ethan and Madison were doing right now. Were they strategizing their next approach? Researching assisted living facilities they could recommend? Or had they simply written me off as a stubborn old man who'd eventually come around when loneliness wore down his resistance? They didn't understand that loneliness wasn't my enemy anymore. I'd made peace with it, had learned to distinguish between being alone and being lonely. Caroline's presence still filled this house in ways that had nothing to do with physical occupation. Her books still lined the shelves, her plants still thrived under my care, her voice still whispered in the settling of timbers she'd helped me choose. This wasn't just a house. It was a marriage made manifest, love translated into lumber and stone and glass. Every room held stories only I remembered now. The way she'd hummed while cooking, the sound of her typewriter when she was working on her newsletter for the garden club, the squeak of the floorboard outside our bedroom that had warned us when teenage Ethan was trying to sneak out after curfew. Ethan wanted me to trade all of that for the sterile comfort of an assisted living facility, where every surface would be sanitized and every memory would belong to someone else, where I'd be Richard from 304 instead of the man who'd built a life with his own hands. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, its sound echoing through rooms that had heard that chime nearly 12,000 times since Caroline and I had bought it at an estate sale in Millbrook. We'd argued about the price. She thought it was too much, I thought it was too beautiful to pass up. She'd been wrong about the money, I'd been right about the beauty, but we'd both been right about its importance to our home. That clock had measured our marriage in quarter-hour increments, had marked the passage of days both ordinary and extraordinary. It had chimed through birthday parties and Christmas mornings, through quiet Sunday afternoons and sleepless nights when one of us was sick. It had counted down Caroline's final weeks with mechanical precision, indifferent to our prayers for more time. Now it measured my solitude, and I found comfort in its constancy. Some things endured, some things kept faith even when people didn't. I finished my coffee and began the evening routine, checking the locks, turning off lights, setting the automatic timer for the porch light that would come on at dawn. In the bedroom, I paused before Caroline's dresser, where our wedding photo still sat in its silver frame. We looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. She wore her grandmother's dress and the pearl necklace I'd given her for our first anniversary. I wore a rented tux and an expression of stunned joy that I'd managed to convince this remarkable woman to spend her life with me. "They want me to leave," I said to her image. "Our son wants me to give up everything we built together." The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but I could imagine what she'd say if she could. Caroline had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when the stakes mattered. She'd fought the insurance company when they'd tried to deny coverage for my heart surgery. She'd fought the county when they'd wanted to rezone our road for commercial development. She'd fought her cancer with grace and determination until the very end. Fight, I could almost hear her whisper. Don't let them take what's ours. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure from Ethan and his in-laws. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by the life Caroline and I had chosen together. They could ask, they could plead, they could guilt and manipulate and threaten. But they couldn't make me leave, not unless I chose to go. Subscribe now to see how experience and determination can level any playing field, especially when someone underestimates the quiet strength of a man with nothing left to lose. I woke before dawn, not from any sound or disturbance, but from the strange clarity that sometimes comes after a sleepless night spent thinking. The kind of clarity that cuts through confusion, like a blade through soft wood, revealing the grain beneath. I lay in the darkness for a few minutes, listening to the house breathe around me, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: purpose. In construction, you learn that every project begins with a foundation. You survey the land, you test the soil, you calculate load-bearing requirements. Only fools start building without understanding what they're working with. Ethan and his in-laws had made their opening move, but they'd revealed their hand too early, shown me exactly what kind of ground we were standing on. They wanted me gone. Everything else, the concern for my welfare, the talk of family obligation, the carefully constructed arguments about practicality, was window dressing. The truth was simpler. I was an obstacle to their comfort, an inconvenience to be managed. I rose and made coffee in the pre-dawn quiet. My movements automatic but purposeful. Through the kitchen window, the lake was invisible in the darkness, but I could hear the gentle lap of water against the dock, the sound that had been our lullaby for 32 years. By the time the sun crested the pine trees, I was sitting at Caroline's desk with a yellow legal pad, making lists. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "What I know." Underneath, I began cataloging facts with the methodical precision I'd once used for project estimates. Ethan's financial situation, ambitious but possibly unstable, given the expensive lifestyle and the need to house his in-laws. Madison's parents, retired, lease ending, looking for a permanent solution they couldn't afford elsewhere. The timing of their visit, coordinated, planned, suggesting they'd been discussing this for weeks or months without including me in the conversation. On the second page, what I own. The house, free and clear, 43 acres of lakefront property, worth considerably more now than when Caroline and I had bought it. The contents, furniture I'd built, art Caroline had chosen, a lifetime of accumulated possessions that had meaning beyond their monetary value. My construction business, officially retired, but still generating income from commercial properties I'd built and continued to manage. On the third page, what I can do. Here I paused, pen hovering over paper. In my younger days, I might have relied on physical intimidation, the implied threat of a man who'd spent decades working with his hands. But I was 73 now, and besides, that wasn't who Caroline had married. She'd fallen in love with a builder, not a destroyer. I could be smarter than they expected. Ethan saw me as a relic, a man clinging to the past because he couldn't adapt to the present. Let him think that. Let them all think that. Underestimation was a gift I could use. The phone rang at 9:30. I let it go to the machine, listening as Madison's voice filled the kitchen. Honey sweet, but with steel underneath. "Richard, hi, it's Madison. I wanted to apologize if this morning felt overwhelming. We're just worried about you, you know? Living out there all alone with winter coming. Maybe we could talk again soon. Just you and me this time, without all the complications." I deleted the message without saving it. Madison thought she could succeed where the group had failed, that her softer approach would crack my resolve. She didn't understand that I'd spent 40 years in business, dealing with people who thought that they could charm me into bad contracts. I knew the difference between genuine concern and manipulation wrapped in silk. The morning was still young when I drove into Millbrook, the county seat where I'd done business for decades. The town looked smaller than it had when Caroline and I first moved to the lake. Its main street lined with a mix of old storefronts and new businesses trying to capture tourist dollars. But the courthouse still dominated the square, its red brick and white columns as solid and unchanging as the law it housed. I parked in front of Henderson and Associates, the law firm that had handled my business contracts for 20 years. Margaret Henderson had been Caroline's friend since high school, had stood as a witness at our wedding, had helped us navigate the legal maze when we'd bought the lake house. If anyone would understand what I was facing, it would be her. The receptionist recognized me immediately. "Mr. Dalton, how good to see you. Mrs. Henderson is with a client, but I know she'll want to—" "Tell her it's about family business," I said. "I'll wait." Margaret's office hadn't changed much in 2 decades. Same oak desk, same leather chairs, same law books that looked like they'd been consulted rather than displayed. When she emerged from her inner office, she looked exactly as I remembered. Silver hair in a neat bob, sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the bearing of a woman who had spent her career making sure contracts said what they meant. "Richard," she hugged me briefly, the kind of careful embrace you give someone who's still healing. "How are you managing?" "Some days better than others. Today might be one of the better ones." She gestured to a chair. "What can I do for you?" I told her everything. Ethan's visit, the demands, Patricia's follow-up call. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the same yellow legal pads I favored. When I finished, she leaned back and steepled her fingers. "They can't force you to sell," she said. "Not legally. The property is titled in your name alone since Caroline's passing. But that doesn't mean they can't make your life difficult." "How?" "Emotional pressure, financial pressure, if they can find leverage. Adult children have been known to claim their parents are no longer competent to make decisions about their own welfare." The words hit like ice water. "They'd try to have me declared incompetent?" "I'm not saying they will. I'm saying it's a tool people sometimes use when other methods fail. It's hard to prove and harder to stick, especially if the alleged incompetent person has good legal representation." She smiled slightly. "Which you do." "What do I need to do?" "First, we make sure your documentation is bulletproof. Will, power of attorney, healthcare directives, everything current and crystal clear. Second, we consider restructuring your assets in ways that make them harder to challenge or manipulate." Margaret opened a file drawer and pulled out several forms. "I'm thinking a revocable living trust. You remain in complete control during your lifetime, but the structure makes it much more difficult for anyone to contest your decisions or force unwanted changes." I studied the papers she spread before me. Legal language that would have seemed like hieroglyphics to the younger man I'd once been, but which I'd learned to read during 40 years of contracts and property deals. "And if they still try to have me declared incompetent? Then we'll be ready. Medical evaluations, cognitive tests, character witnesses. We'll show any court that you're thinking clearly and making rational decisions about your own life." By noon, I'd signed the preliminary paperwork authorizing Margaret to restructure my assets. The trust would take a few weeks to finalize, but the wheels were in motion. I left her office feeling something I hadn't experienced in months: control. On the drive home, I stopped at Murphy's Diner, a place where Caroline and I used to eat Sunday breakfast after church. The waitress was new, but the coffee was the same, strong enough to wake the dead, served in heavy white mugs that had probably been there since the Carter administration. I ordered eggs over easy and wheat toast, the kind of simple meal that doesn't require decisions or explanations. At the counter, 2 men in work clothes discussed a roofing job, their conversation peppered with the technical details I'd once lived and breathed. Listening to them felt like hearing a familiar song played in a distant room. "Excuse me," I looked up to find a woman in her 50s standing beside my booth, wearing scrubs and a tired smile. "You're Richard Dalton, aren't you? I'm Susan Torres. I was one of Caroline's nurses at the end." I remembered her, the one who had always taken time to explain what the machines were doing, who'd brought Caroline ice chips when her mouth was too dry for water. "Susan, good to see you. How are you doing? Really doing, I mean." It was a simple question, but it caught me off guard. When was the last time someone had asked how I was doing without wanting something from me in return? "I'm managing," I said. "Some days better than others." She slid into the booth across from me without being invited, the way people do when they have something important to say. "I heard through the grapevine that you're having some family difficulties. People talk in a town this size." I nodded but didn't elaborate. "For what it's worth," she said, "Caroline used to talk about you a lot during those long nights, about how proud she was of the life you'd built together, how much she worried about you being alone after she was gone. She worried about a lot of things she couldn't control. Yes, but she also said you were stronger than you knew, that when push came to shove, you'd find a way to protect what mattered. Susan finished her coffee and stood to leave. Caroline also said something else. She said the measure of a man wasn't how much he could accumulate, but how well he could defend what he'd earned. After she left, I sat in the diner's worn booth, watching the afternoon light slant through windows that hadn't been washed in too long. Caroline's words, filtered through Susan's memory, felt like a message from beyond the grave. A reminder that I wasn't just defending a house, I was defending a life, a marriage, a set of values that had taken decades to build. By the time I returned to the lake house, the sun was setting behind the pines, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, studying the house with new eyes. Not as a burden or an emptiness, but as a fortress, something worth defending. Inside, I went straight to Caroline's desk and pulled out the yellow legal pad I'd started that morning. Under What I Can Do, I began writing again, this time with the focused intensity I'd once brought to complex building projects. Call Margaret Monday morning, finalize trust documents, research assisted living facilities, know what they're really like, document every conversation, every pressure tactic, find out what Ethan's really facing financially, prepare for a long fight. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times as I finished writing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts at manipulation or coercion. But tonight, for the first time since Caroline's death, I felt like I was thinking clearly again. The fog of grief and confusion that had clouded my judgment for months was lifting, replaced by the sharp focus I'd once brought to complex construction projects. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the dock, where Caroline and I had shared our evening coffee for 32 summers. The water was calm, reflecting the first stars of the night sky. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called, its voice wild and lonely, but undeniably free. "I'm not giving up," I said to the darkness, to Caroline's memory, to the house that had sheltered our love for 3 decades. "They think I'm weak, but they don't know what I'm made of." I turned away from the window and walked through the rooms, turning on lights, claiming space. This was my house, my property, my choice. And I was done being pushed around by people who confused love with control, who mistook accommodation for weakness. The real fight was about to begin. Subscribe and hit the bell. This story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The call came at 7:30 on a Monday morning, early enough to suggest urgency, but late enough to catch me after I'd had my coffee and cleared my head. Margaret Henderson's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear satisfaction underneath. "Richard, the trust documents are ready. Can you come in this morning? I'll be there at 9. I dressed carefully, not the work clothes I usually wore around the house, but the good slacks and sport coat I'd bought for Caroline's funeral. If this was going to be the day I took legal control of my own life, I wanted to look the part. Margaret's office smelled of leather and old paper, scents that spoke of permanence and careful attention to detail. She spread the trust documents across her desk, like blueprints for a complex building project. "Here's how it works," she said, pointing to the relevant sections. "You transfer ownership of all your major assets, the house, the land, your business interests, to the Richard Dalton Family Trust. You remain the sole trustee, which means you control everything exactly as you do now. But legally, the assets belong to the trust, not to you personally. And that protects them how? Several ways. First, it makes any competency challenge much more complicated. Even if someone convinced a court you couldn't manage your personal affairs, they'd still have to prove you couldn't function as a trustee, a much higher legal standard. Second, it protects the assets from claims against you personally. And third," she smiled, "it gives you some very interesting options for how those assets are distributed after your death." I read through the documents carefully, my construction-trained eye catching details that might have escaped someone else. Everything looked solid, well-built. But one section caught my attention. "This clause about charitable remainder," I said. "What does that mean?" "It means you can designate a charity to receive the assets if certain conditions aren't met. For instance, if your beneficiaries contest the trust or behave in ways that violate your stated wishes." I looked up from the papers. "You mean I could cut them out entirely if they keep pushing?" "More than that. You could donate everything to a charity of your choice, leaving them with nothing but the knowledge that their own behavior cost them their inheritance." The idea was both liberating and terrifying. I'd spent years assuming that everything I'd built would eventually go to Ethan. that parental love required financial provision regardless of personal behavior. But Margaret was offering me something different, the power to make my legacy conditional on respect. What kind of charity? Whatever matters to you, veterans organizations, medical research, local historical societies, the choice is entirely yours. I thought about the American Legion post where I'd been a member for 20 years, about the scholarship fund Caroline had contributed to every Christmas, about the volunteer fire department that had been there when we'd needed them during the ice storm of '98. I want to include a clause, I said slowly, that if my beneficiaries attempt to contest this trust or take legal action to force me from my home, the assets transfer immediately to the Veterans Heritage Foundation. Margaret made notes on her legal pad. Ironclad and completely legal. By 10:30, I'd signed everything. The notary's seal pressed into the paper with a satisfying thump, making it official. I was no longer just Richard Dalton, widower and father. I was Richard Dalton, trustee of his own destiny. How long before this is legally binding? I asked. The moment you signed, but I'll file copies with the county recorder today, just to make sure there's a clear paper trail. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months. The trust documents in my briefcase represented more than legal protection. They were a declaration of independence, proof that I still had choices in how my story would end. But first, I needed to understand exactly what kind of pressure I was facing. That afternoon, I made a call I'd been putting off for weeks. Danny Morrison had been my accountant for 15 years, a detail-oriented man who understood the difference between privacy and secrecy. If anyone could help me understand Ethan's financial situation, it would be him. Richard, Danny's voice was warm but concerned. I was wondering when you'd call. I've been hearing some interesting things about your son's business ventures. What kind of things? The kind that make accountants nervous. Word is he's leveraged pretty heavily on some real estate deals that haven't panned out. There was a bankruptcy filing for his consulting firm last month. Did you know about that? I felt the coffee turn cold in my stomach. No, I didn't. It was a strategic filing, probably to buy time. But Richard, if he's in the kind of financial trouble I think he is, he might be getting desperate. Desperate people make poor decisions. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen staring out at the lake. The water was choppy today, whitecaps rolling across the surface in irregular patterns. A storm was coming. I could feel it in the air, in the way the light had taken on that greenish cast that always preceded heavy weather. My phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. Dad, we need to talk. Can you come to dinner Thursday? Madison's making pot roast. I stared at the message for a long time. Pot roast had been Caroline's specialty. The meal she'd made for every birthday, every celebration, every time we'd needed comfort food to smooth over family tensions. Madison had never made pot roast in her life. I'd eaten enough of her cooking to know her repertoire ran more toward takeout and catered affairs. This was bait. The question was what they were trying to catch. I typed back, Thursday works. What time? His response came immediately, 6 p.m., looking forward to clearing the air. Clearing the air. As if our disagreement was just a misunderstanding that could be resolved over dinner conversation. Wednesday evening, I called my old friend Joe Castellano. Joe had been my foreman on the biggest commercial project I'd ever tackled, a shopping center that had required 2 years of careful planning and precise execution. He'd retired to Florida 5 years ago, but we still talked every few months. Richard, you old bastard, Joe's voice carried the same warmth it always had. How you holding up? Could be better. Joe, I need some advice. Not about construction, about family. I gave him the broad strokes. Joe listened without interrupting, the way he had during those long planning sessions when we'd worked through problems that seemed impossible at first glance. Let me ask you something, he said when I finished. If this were a construction project and the client kept changing the specs, kept demanding things that weren't in the original contract, what would you do? Walk away or make them pay for the changes? So, why is family different? The question hung in the air. Why was family different? Because blood was supposed to mean something? Because love was supposed to be unconditional? Because good fathers were supposed to sacrifice everything for their children's happiness? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe it's not, Joe said. Maybe family relationships need contracts too. Clear expectations, defined boundaries, consequences for breaking the terms. Thursday arrived gray and cold, with the kind of biting wind that found every gap in your jacket and reminded you that winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. I dressed carefully, good slacks, the navy sweater Caroline had bought me for Christmas 3 years ago, shoes polished to the shine she'd always insisted on for important occasions. The drive to Ethan's house took 40 minutes through countryside that was settling into dormancy. Cornfields cut to stubble, maple trees blazing red and gold against the pewter sky, farmhouses with smoke rising from chimneys as families gathered for dinner. Ethan lived in a development called Whispering Pines, though most of the pines had been cut down to make room for houses that all looked like variations on the same theme. His was a colonial revival with white columns and black shutters, the kind of place that looked impressive from the street but felt hollow once you got inside. Madison opened the door before I could knock, wearing an apron over a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile was practiced, perfect, the kind you see in magazine advertisements for family dinners. "Richard, so glad you could come. Dinner's almost ready." The house smelled of pot roast, but underneath was the chemical tang of room freshener, as if someone had been trying to cover up a different scent. In the living room, Gerald and Patricia Monroe sat on a cream-colored sofa, drinks in hand, looking like they had been posed for a photograph. "Richard," Gerald stood, extending his hand. "Good to see you again." I shook his hand, but didn't return the sentiment. Patricia offered me her cheek again, and again I declined. "Drink?" Ethan asked, appearing from the kitchen with a glass of whiskey already poured. "Your usual?" I hadn't had a usual in 3 years, not since the heart medication made alcohol inadvisable, but Ethan either didn't remember or didn't care. "Just water," I said. His smile flickered. "Come on, Dad. 1 drink won't hurt." "Water," I repeated. He set the whiskey on the coffee table and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a glass of ice water that he handed to me with visible reluctance. The ice clinked against the glass, the only sound in a room that had suddenly become too quiet. "Dinner's ready," Madison announced, her voice bright with forced cheer. The dining room table was set with china I'd never seen before, probably a wedding gift that had been saved for special occasions. The pot roast sat in the center, surrounded by carrots and potatoes that looked like they'd been arranged by someone who understood presentation better than cooking. We took our seats, me at one end of the table, Ethan and Madison on one side, the Monroes on the other, like a business meeting disguised as a family dinner. "This looks wonderful," I said, because Caroline had taught me to compliment the cook even when the meal was clearly a means to an end. "Thank you," Madison beamed. "I used Caroline's recipe." It was a lie. Caroline's pot roast had never looked this perfect, this staged. Her food had character, slightly uneven vegetables, gravy that was sometimes too thick, rolls that were occasionally burned around the edges. This meal looked like it had been catered and transferred to serving dishes, but I said nothing. I was here to listen, to understand what they really wanted, to gather information I could use later. The conversation started safely. The weather, local news, Patricia's volunteer work at the community center. But I could feel them circling towards something, the way predators circle before they strike. "Richard," Gerald said as Madison served dessert, store-bought apple pie trying to pass as homemade. "We've been thinking more about our conversation the other day. Have you? About the practicalities of your situation. The isolation, the maintenance requirements, the fact that you're alone in that big house." "I like being alone in that big house." Patricia leaned forward, her voice taking on the patronizing tone people use when they think they're dealing with someone who can't understand their own best interests. "But what about winter, Richard? What about emergencies? What if you fall and no one finds you for days?" "Then I'll have died in my own home," I said calmly. "There are worse ways to go." The table went silent. Madison's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Ethan's jaw tightened in a way that reminded me of his teenage years, when he'd been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. "Dad," he said finally, "that's not funny." "I wasn't trying to be funny, I was trying to be honest." Gerald cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss some alternatives. Compromise solutions that would give you the security you need while also helping us with our housing situation." "Such as?" "A duplex arrangement," Patricia said eagerly. "We could convert part of the house into a separate living space. You'd have your privacy, we'd have ours, but there would be people nearby if you needed help." I looked around the table at their expectant faces. They'd rehearsed this, planned it out like a sales presentation. The concerned family, the reasonable compromise, the elderly father who would surely see the wisdom of their proposal. "No," I said. "No?" Ethan's voice rose slightly. "Just like that? No discussion, no consideration of what we're offering. What you're offering," I said, "is to let you move into my house and pretend it's for my benefit." "It would be for your benefit," Madison insisted. "You'd have help with cooking, cleaning, maintenance." "I don't need help with any of those things." "Not yet," Gerald said. "But you will. Age catches up with all of us, Richard. Wouldn't it be better to plan ahead rather than wait for a crisis?" I set down my fork and looked at each of them in turn. The staged dinner, the rehearsed arguments, the way they spoke about my future as if I weren't sitting right there, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. "You're not worried about my welfare," I said quietly. "You're worried about your own. Gerald's retirement income isn't covering your expenses. Patricia's medical bills are more than you expected. And Ethan," I looked directly at my son, "Ethan's business is failing, and he needs a place to put you because he can't afford to help you himself." The silence that followed was absolute. Gerald's face went pale. Patricia's hand flew to her throat. Madison looked like she'd been slapped, but it was Ethan's expression that told me everything. Not surprise, not denial, just the cold calculation of a man whose bluff had been called. "Dad," he said, his voice careful and controlled, "I don't know where you're getting your information." "From the county courthouse," I said. "From the bankruptcy filings, from the lien notices. It's all public record if you know where to look." I stood up, pulling my jacket from the back of the chair. "Thank you for dinner. The pot roast was interesting, even if it wasn't Caroline's recipe." "Dad, wait." Ethan stood too, his composure finally cracking. "Don't leave like this. We can work something out." "We already have," I said. "You've shown me exactly who you are, and I've decided exactly what I'm going to do about it." I walked to the front door, aware of their voices rising behind me, Patricia's shrill protests, Gerald's attempts at reason, Madison's angry denials. But I didn't turn back. Outside, the night air was sharp and clean, cutting through the cloying warmth of their manufactured hospitality. I sat in my truck for a moment, hands steady on the wheel, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of a job well done. They'd expected compliance, they'd gotten resistance, they'd offered manipulation, I'd responded with truth. They'd counted on my isolation making me vulnerable. Instead, it had made me clear-headed. The drive home gave me time to think, to plan my next moves. The trust was in place, protecting my assets from any legal challenge they might mount. But protection was only the beginning. If they were going to treat me like an obstacle to be removed, I'd show them what a real obstacle looked like. Back at the lake house, I sat at Caroline's desk and opened the yellow legal pad to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote, "Project Defense." Underneath, I began listing tasks with the same methodical approach I'd once used for construction schedules. Document all future contact, dates, times, exact words. Research their financial situation more thoroughly. Install security system, cameras, motion detectors. Prepare alternative living arrangements for the Monroes. Make my position absolutely clear. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times as I finished writing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new pressure tactics, new attempts to wear down my resistance. But tonight, I felt ready for whatever they might try. I walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the small rituals that marked the end of each day. In the bedroom, I paused before Caroline's dresser, where our wedding photo still sat in its silver frame. "They think they can intimidate me," I told her image. "They don't understand that you can't intimidate a man who's already lost everything that really mattered." But that wasn't quite true anymore. I hadn't lost everything. I still had this house, these memories, the life we'd built together. And I had something else now, the determination to protect what remained. The phone rang just as I was settling into bed. Ethan's number. I let it go to the machine, listening as his voice filled the quiet house. "Dad, I know you're upset, but think about what you're doing. Think about family. Think about what Mom would have wanted." I erased the message without saving it. Caroline would have wanted me to stand my ground, to protect what we'd built together, to not let anyone, even our son, take advantage of my grief. The next morning brought clarity as sharp as the October air. I had work to do. Subscribe to see the master builder at work. The hardware store in Millbrook still smelled the way it had when I was building my first house 40 years ago. Sawdust and metal polish, WD-40 and possibility. Tom Henderson looked up from his inventory sheets when I walked in, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "Richard, haven't seen you in a while. How are you managing?" "Getting by. Listen, Tom, I need some security equipment. Motion sensors, maybe a camera system, nothing too elaborate." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly. "Everything all right out at the lake?" "Probably. But I'd rather be careful than sorry." He nodded and led me to the back corner of the store, where boxes of electronic equipment sat on metal shelving. "Most folks go wireless these days," he said, pulling down a package. "Easy to install, connects to your phone. You can monitor everything remotely." I bought a basic system, 4 cameras, motion detectors, a central hub that would alert me to any unusual activity. Tom offered to install it, but I declined. This was something I needed to do myself, to understand completely. "You sure?" Tom asked. "These new systems can be tricky if you're not used to them." "I'll figure it out," I said. "I've been figuring things out for 73 years. Back at the lake house, I spread the instruction manuals across the kitchen table, like blueprints. The technology was different from what I'd worked with in construction, but the principles were the same. Understand your materials, plan your approach, execute with precision. I started with the cameras, one overlooking the driveway, positioned to capture anyone approaching the house, one focused on the front door, angled to show faces clearly, 2 more covering the sides and back of the house, eliminating blind spots where someone might try to approach unseen. The installation took most of the afternoon. I mounted the cameras high enough to avoid casual tampering, but positioned them to capture clear images of anyone who came calling. The motion sensors went near the windows and doors, most likely to be used for unauthorized entry. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the chess games Caroline and I used to play on winter evenings. She'd been the better player, with an intuitive understanding of strategy that often caught me off guard. "You think too much about individual moves," she'd tell me. "Chess isn't about the next move. It's about the move after the next move." I was thinking about that now. Ethan's opening gambit had been direct but clumsy, a frontal assault that had revealed his intentions too clearly. Whatever came next would be more subtle, more carefully planned. I needed to be ready. When I finished with the cameras, I tested the system from inside the house, watching myself on the phone screen as I walked the perimeter. The image quality was sharp, the motion detection sensitive but not overly so. I could monitor the entire property from anywhere with cell service. But cameras were just the beginning. If they were determined to pressure me into leaving, they'd escalate beyond simple visits. I needed to be prepared for more aggressive tactics. I drove to the county seat that evening, parking outside the office of Peterson Investigations. Jack Peterson had been a sheriff's deputy for 20 years before going private, specializing in background checks and discreet inquiries. I'd used his services occasionally for construction projects, where I'd needed to verify contractor credentials. "Richard," Jack stood when I entered his office, extending a calloused hand. "Good to see you. What can I do for you?" "I need background information on my son and his family. Financial records, business dealings, anything that might explain why they're suddenly so interested in my living arrangements." Jack's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Family investigations were always complicated, often ugly. "You sure about this? Once you know something, you can't unknow it." "I'm sure." He quoted me a retainer fee, reasonable for the kind of thorough investigation I was requesting. I wrote him a check on the spot. "How deep do you want me to go?" "Deep enough to understand what I'm really dealing with." Jack nodded and made notes on an intake form. "I'll start with public records, court filings, property transfers, business registrations. If I need to go further, I'll call first." "How long?" "Week, maybe 10 days for a complete picture." Driving home, I felt the pieces of my defense strategy falling into place. Legal protection through the trust, physical security through the cameras, intelligence gathering through Jack's investigation. I was building something, the way I'd always built things, with careful planning, quality materials, and attention to detail. The phone was ringing when I walked into the house. Ethan's number. "Dad, about tomorrow night, Madison wanted me to ask if you have any dietary restrictions we should know about." "I eat what's put in front of me," I said. "Good. And Dad?" Maybe we could talk privately after dinner, just the two of us, clear the air about some things. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss. After we hung up, I walked through the house, checking that all the camera angles were optimal, that the motion sensors were properly calibrated. The system would record everything: who came, when they arrived, how long they stayed. If this situation escalated to legal proceedings, I'd have documentation of every interaction. In Caroline's study, I opened her desk drawer and pulled out the folder where she'd kept our important papers: insurance policies, medical records, the deed to the house. I added the trust documents Margaret had given me, creating a file that told the story of a man taking control of his own destiny. The next morning, I received a call that crystallized everything I'd been suspecting. "Mr. Dalton, this is Janet Morrison from First National Bank. I wanted to follow up on your son's inquiry about your accounts." My blood went cold. "What inquiry?" "He called yesterday asking about your banking relationship with us. Wanted to know about your account balances and whether you had designated anyone as a co-signer or beneficiary. I told him I couldn't discuss customer information without written authorization, but I thought you should know about the call. Thank you for calling, Janet, and thank you for following protocol." "Of course. But, Mr. Dalton, if you are concerned about account security, we can add additional verification requirements. Password protection, photo ID for any transactions over a certain amount." "Do it," I said. "All of it." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen staring out at the lake. The water was rough today, driven by a wind that bent the pine trees and sent leaves skittering across the dock. Ethan wasn't just planning to pressure me into leaving, he was actively investigating my financial situation, looking for leverage points he could exploit. But he'd made a mistake. By contacting my bank directly, he'd revealed the scope of his planning. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment family concern. It was a calculated campaign to gain control of my assets. I opened the yellow legal pad and added another line to my growing list: bank accounts secured, Ethan fishing for financial information. The afternoon brought another surprise. A knock at the door, not the confident rap of family or the apologetic tap of a neighbor, but the official sound of business. Through the new camera system, I could see a man in his 40s wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. "Mr. Dalton, I'm James Crawford from Hartwell & Associates. I understand you might be considering putting your property on the market." "Who told you that?" "Your son contacted us about providing a valuation. He mentioned you were exploring your options regarding relocation." I felt my jaw tighten. "Mr. Crawford, I'm not selling my house. My son has made an error in judgment." Crawford's smile faltered. "Oh, well, perhaps we could just take a quick look around, give you some numbers to consider. No obligation, of course." "No," I said, and closed the door. Through the window, I watched him walk back to his car, making notes on a clipboard. He sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, probably calling Ethan to report his failure. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Ethan wasn't just pressuring me directly. He was creating the appearance of market activity around my property, possibly to use in competency proceedings later. "Look, Your Honor, my father is refusing to consider reasonable offers for a property that's clearly too much for him to manage." But I was documenting everything now. The camera had recorded Crawford's visit, captured his license plate, provided a timestamp for when he'd arrived and left. If this escalated to legal proceedings, I'd have evidence of Ethan's behind-the-scenes maneuvering. That evening, as I prepared for dinner at Ethan's house, I made one final addition to my preparations. I slipped a small digital recorder into my jacket pocket, the kind I'd used for recording job site notes when projects got complicated. If tonight's conversation was going to be about my future, I wanted an accurate record of exactly what was said and by whom. The drive to Whispering Pines felt different this time, not like visiting family, but like going into battle. The houses looked the same, their windows glowing with warm light, smoke rising from chimneys where families gathered for evening meals. But I no longer felt like I belonged in that world of domestic tranquility. I was a man with a mission now, armed with legal protections and electronic surveillance, ready to defend what was mine against people who'd chosen to see me as an obstacle rather than a father. The recorder in my pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, like Caroline's hand resting over my heart, reminding me that some fights were worth having. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The second dinner felt different from the moment I walked through the door. The same house, the same people, but the air carried a tension that hadn't been there before. Madison greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and Ethan's handshake lingered a beat too long, as if he were testing my resolve. "Dad, glad you could make it. Can I get you that drink now?" "Water," I said, the same answer as before, but this time he was ready. "Come on, just one, for old time's sake." "What old times would those be?" His smile flickered. "The times when we could sit down as family and work things out." "We can still do that," I said. "We just might not reach the conclusion you were expecting." Gerald and Patricia Monroe were already seated in the living room, but their posture was different tonight. Less casual, more alert, like people preparing for a business negotiation rather than a family dinner. Patricia's handbag sat open beside her chair, a manila folder visible inside. "Richard," Gerald stood, his handshake firm but brief. "Thank you for coming. Madison's outdone herself again." The dining room table was set with the same china as before, but tonight there was an additional place setting. Empty, but deliberately placed at the head of the table opposite from where I'd sit. "Are we expecting someone else, I asked. "Just wanted to make sure there was room," Madison said quickly, "in case we needed more space." More space for what? Documents? Legal papers? A witness I hadn't been told about? The recorder in my jacket pocket felt warm against my ribs as I took my seat. I'd tested it that afternoon. 60 minutes of recording time, crystal clear audio quality. Whatever they had planned for tonight, I'd have a record of every word. "So," Gerald said as Madison served the salad, "we've been giving a lot of thought to your situation, Richard." "My situation seems fine to me." "Well, that's just it." Patricia leaned forward, her voice taking on that patronizing tone I was beginning to recognize. "Sometimes it's hard to see our own circumstances objectively. That's why family is so important, to provide perspective." "What kind of perspective?" Ethan set down his fork and pulled a folder from beneath his napkin. "The kind that comes from facts, Dad. Real numbers, professional assessments." He opened the folder and spread several documents across the table. Property valuations, cost of living analyses, retirement community brochures. The presentation was slick, professional, like something he might use with his consulting clients. "The house is assessed at $490,000, he said, pointing to one of the papers. "But in today's market, you could probably get $50,000, maybe more. That's a significant asset sitting idle." "It's not idle. I live there. But you're only using maybe 20% of the space," Madison chimed in. "The rest is just empty rooms gathering dust." Gerald nodded sagely. "From a financial standpoint, it's inefficient. You could sell the property, move to a nice apartment or assisted living facility, and have enough left over to ensure a very comfortable retirement." "I'm already comfortable." "Are you?" Patricia's voice sharpened slightly. "Winter's coming, Richard. What if there's another ice storm like the one 5 years ago? What if you lose power for days? What if you have a medical emergency and there's no one around to help?" They'd rehearsed this too, I realized, each argument building on the last, designed to create a sense of inevitable crisis that only their solution could solve. "I managed the ice storm 5 years ago," I said. "I'll manage the next one too." "You were younger then," Ethan said, "and you had Mom." The mention of Caroline felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. Using her memory to manipulate me was a new low, even for him. "Your mother," I said carefully, "would have told you to mind your own business and let your father make his own decisions." "Would she?" Madison's voice carried a challenge. "Or would she have wanted to make sure you were safe and cared for?" I looked around the table at their expectant faces. This was the moment they had been building toward, the emotional climax of their carefully orchestrated performance. "She would have wanted," I said slowly, "to know why her son was contacting real estate agents without my knowledge, why he was calling my bank asking about my accounts, why he was pressuring me to make decisions that benefit everyone except me." The silence that followed was profound. Gerald's face went pale. Patricia's hand froze halfway to her water glass. Madison looked like she'd been slapped, but it was Ethan's expression that told me everything I needed to know. Not surprise at being caught, just cold calculation as he decided how to respond. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally. "James Crawford from Hartwell and Associates? He came to my house yesterday afternoon, said you'd contacted him about a property valuation. Janet Morrison from First National called to tell me you'd been fishing for information about my bank accounts." Each fact hit the table like a hammer blow. Gerald shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Patricia's face flushed red. "I was trying to help," Ethan said, his voice defensive now, "to get you the information you'd need to make an informed decision. I didn't ask for help. I didn't ask for information. I asked to be left alone." "And that's exactly the problem," Patricia burst out. "You're isolating yourself, refusing to consider perfectly reasonable suggestions, acting like we're the enemy when all we want is to help." "Help yourselves, you mean?" Gerald cleared his throat. "Richard, I understand you're suspicious of our motives, but the fact is we're all family now. When family members are struggling, we help each other." "How exactly are you struggling, Gerald?" The question caught him off guard. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. "Well, the retirement income isn't with Patricia's medical expenses." "Your medical expenses," I said, turning to Patricia, "or your lifestyle expenses." "I don't see how that's relevant," she said stiffly. "It's relevant because you're asking me to solve a problem you haven't been honest about. You're not looking for somewhere to live. You're looking for somewhere to live that you don't have to pay for." Madison's face had gone from flushed to pale. "Richard, that's not fair. What's not fair is ambushing me with real estate agents and bank inquiries. What's not fair is treating me like an obstacle to your financial planning rather than a person with rights and feelings." I stood up, pulling the recorder from my pocket and setting it on the table. The small device looked innocent enough, but the reaction it caused was immediate and dramatic. "Have you been recording us?" Ethan's voice rose to nearly a shout. "I've been protecting myself," I said calmly, "from people who think they can manipulate me into giving up everything I've worked for." Gerald stared at the recorder like it was a poisonous snake. This is entrapment. This is documentation, and it's perfectly legal in this state as long as one party to the conversation consents. I consent. I picked up the recorder and slipped it back into my pocket. "Thank you for dinner. The roast was better than last time, though still not Caroline's recipe." "Dad, wait." Ethan stood too, his composure finally cracking completely. "Don't walk away from this. We can work something out." "We already have. You've shown me exactly what you think of me, and I've decided exactly what I'm going to do about it." "What does that mean?" I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it on the table where the property valuations had been. "It means I've made some decisions of my own. The house, the property, all of my assets, they're now held in a revocable living trust. I control everything during my lifetime, but if anyone tries to contest my wishes or force me from my home, the assets transfer immediately to the Veterans Heritage Foundation." The color drained from Ethan's face. "You can't do that." "I already have. It's all legal, properly executed, filed with the county. The paperwork is in that envelope, along with copies for each of you." Patricia grabbed the envelope, spilling documents across the table. Her face went white as she scanned the legal text. This is blackmail," she stammered. "This is a boundary," I corrected. "Cross it and you get nothing. Respect it, and we might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship. Your choice." I walked toward the front door, aware of their voices rising behind me. Patricia's shrill protests, Gerald's attempts at reason, Madison's shocked silence. But Ethan's voice cut through it all. "Dad, stop, please. Let's talk about this rationally." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. "Rationally? Like the rational way you've been going behind my back for weeks? Like the rational way you've been treating me like a problem to be solved, rather than a father to be respected?" "I was trying to protect you." "From what?" "From making mistakes, from being alone, from—" He struggled for words. "From becoming someone you're not." I turned to face him fully. "Son, I've been exactly who I am for 73 years. The mistake would be pretending to be someone else to make your life easier." Outside, the night air felt clean and sharp after the suffocating atmosphere inside. I sat in my truck for a moment, hands steady on the wheel, and listened to the silence. Not empty silence, but the full quiet of a man who'd said everything that needed saying. The drive home took me through the same countryside as before, but tonight the farmhouses looked different, not like symbols of family warmth, but like fortresses where people had learned to protect what mattered to them. At the lake house, I walked through each room, checking the camera feeds on my phone, ensuring that all systems were functioning properly. The motion sensors were armed, the recording devices active. If they decided to escalate beyond dinnertime ambushes, I'd be ready. In Caroline's study, I opened the fireproof box where I kept our most important documents. I added a new file folder, Family Conflict, October 24. Inside went copies of all the trust documents, transcripts of my conversations with the real estate agent and bank manager, and detailed notes from both dinners at Ethan's house. If this ended up in court, I'd have documentation of every step, every conversation, every attempt to pressure me into decisions I didn't want to make. But more than that, I'd have proof that I'd been thinking clearly throughout the entire process, making rational decisions based on solid legal advice. The grandfather clock chimed 10 times as I finished organizing the files. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, angry phone calls probably, maybe visits from lawyers or social workers or other people enlisted in their campaign to wear down my resistance. But tonight, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of work well done. I'd built a defense, established boundaries, made my position crystal clear. They could accept those boundaries and try to rebuild our relationship on terms of mutual respect, or they could test them and discover exactly what I meant by consequences. The recorder in my jacket pocket had captured everything. Their admissions about their financial situation, their attempts at emotional manipulation, their shocked reactions when they realized I wasn't the helpless old man they'd taken me for. I thought about Caroline, about what she would have said if she could have seen tonight's performance. She'd always been a good judge of character, had spotted fake people from across a room. She would have been proud of me for finally standing my ground. "I'm not going anywhere," I said aloud to the empty house, to Caroline's memory, to anyone who might be listening. "This is my home, and I intend to keep it." The phone started ringing just as I was getting ready for bed. Ethan's number. I let it go to the machine, then played the message. "Dad, please, call me back. We need to talk. What you did tonight, that's not the end of this. We're family, and family doesn't give up on each other." I erased the message without saving it. Family didn't give up on each other, but it also didn't try to steal from each other. It was a lesson Ethan was about to learn the hard way. Part 7. The Quiet Victory. The call came at 6:30 in the morning, early enough to be either urgent or vindictive. I was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee and the manila folder containing Jack Peterson's investigation report. 3 days had passed since the dinner confrontation. 3 days of silence that I'd used to read every page of what my son had become. The caller ID showed Margaret Henderson's office number. "Richard, I hope I'm not waking you. I've been up for an hour. What's happening? Your son retained an attorney, David Morse from the Morse & Associates firm in the city. He filed a petition yesterday requesting a competency evaluation and temporary conservatorship." I set down my coffee cup, my hand steadier than it should have been. This wasn't a surprise. I'd been expecting it since the night I'd laid the trust documents on Ethan's dinner table. On what grounds? The usual: claims you're unable to manage your affairs, that you're making irrational decisions, that you're isolating yourself and refusing reasonable assistance from family members. And Margaret's voice carried a note of satisfaction. And they made several critical errors. First, they filed too quickly after your trust was established, which makes it look reactive rather than genuinely concerned. Second, they cited your refusal to sell the house as evidence of incompetence, which actually demonstrates clear thinking about your own wishes. Third, and most importantly, they included quotes from conversations that took place at private family dinners. I thought about the recorder in my jacket pocket, about the careful documentation I'd been maintaining. Quotes that might not be accurate, quotes that can be contradicted by your own recordings. "Richard, they've given us everything we need to not just defeat this petition, but to demonstrate that it's a bad faith attempt to circumvent your clearly stated wishes. What do you need from me? A complete medical evaluation from Dr. Morrison, the neuropsychological assessment we discussed, and all your documentation from the past month. Every recording, every note, every photograph from your security system. I'll have everything to you by noon." After we hung up, I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt something unexpected: relief. The waiting was over. The subtle pressure, the family dinners, the carefully worded suggestions, all of it had led to this moment when the masks finally came off and we dealt with each other honestly. I called Dr. Morrison's office first. Sarah Morrison had been my physician for 15 years, had seen me through the heart attack, Caroline's illness, and the grief that followed. If anyone could speak to my mental competence, it would be her. Richard, her voice was warm but concerned when she took my call. I heard through the medical community grapevine that someone's been asking questions about your cognitive state. Would that be family? My son. He's filed a legal petition questioning my competency. Based on what evidence? Based on the fact that I won't let him move his in-laws into my house. The silence that followed spoke volumes. I'll clear my schedule for this afternoon. We'll do a complete evaluation, cognitive function, mental status, decision-making capacity. And Richard, bring any documentation you have of the circumstances leading up to this petition. Context matters in these assessments. Next, I called Dr. Patricia, the neuropsychologist Margaret had recommended. Her testing would be more comprehensive, designed specifically to evaluate my capacity to make complex decisions about my own welfare. Mr. Dalton, I had a call from Margaret Henderson's office yesterday. She mentioned you might need priority scheduling. Family dispute. They're claiming I'm not competent to manage my own affairs. I see. Can you come in tomorrow morning? The full battery of tests takes about 3 hours, but when we're done, you'll have documentation that's bulletproof in court. By noon, I was sitting in Margaret's office with a file folder thick enough to choke a horse. Medical records, bank statements, recordings of every conversation, photographs from the security cameras, Jack Peterson's investigation report, and detailed notes I'd kept throughout the entire ordeal. This is comprehensive, Margaret said, flipping through the pages. Almost obsessively so. I spent 40 years in construction. You document everything, or you get sued. Lucky for us, you never changed habits. She pulled out Jack's report and read through several pages. Richard, some of this information about your son's financial situation, it's worse than you thought. How much worse? According to this, he owes nearly $300,000 to various creditors. His business isn't just struggling, it's insolvent. The house in Whispering Pines is leveraged to the hilt, and he's been using credit cards to pay the mortgage for the past 6 months. I thought about the expensive dinners, the perfectly pressed clothes, the confident demeanor, all of it built on debt and desperation. There's more, Margaret continued. His in-laws aren't just looking for housing assistance. Gerald Monroe filed for bankruptcy 18 months ago. Patricia's medical expenses are legitimate, but they've been using credit cards to pay for treatments their insurance doesn't cover. They're all drowning financially, and your property is the only life preserver in sight. The picture was becoming clear. This wasn't about family concern or my welfare. It was about survival, their survival, financed by my displacement. What's our next step? We respond to the petition with prejudice. We provide evidence that not only are you completely competent, but that this action is motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine concern. And we request sanctions against the petitioner for filing a frivolous claim. Sanctions? Margaret's smile was sharp as winter wind. Legal fees, court costs, and a formal reprimand that goes in the public record. If they want to play hardball, we'll show them what hardball looks like. The court hearing was scheduled for the following Friday. In the intervening days, I lived my normal life with unusual precision. I documented every phone call, every doctor's appointment, every decision I made. I grocery shopped during peak hours when there would be witnesses to my interactions with other people. I had coffee at Murphy's Diner with old friends who could testify to my mental acuity. I volunteered at the American Legion, helping with their monthly newsletter. If the court wanted evidence of my competency, they'd get it in abundance. The night before the hearing, I sat on the dock behind the lake house, watching the sun set behind the pines. The water was calm, reflecting the October sky like polished glass. Caroline had loved this time of day, when the light turned everything golden, and the lake seemed to hold the world in perfect stillness. Tomorrow it ends, I said aloud, my voice carrying across the water. One way or another, this ends tomorrow. A loon called from somewhere across the lake, its voice wild and lonely, but I didn't feel lonely anymore. I felt ready. The courthouse was smaller than I'd expected, its courtroom paneled in dark wood that spoke of permanence and serious purpose. I sat at the defendant's table with Margaret, my hands folded calmly in my lap, while across the aisle, Ethan avoided my gaze. He looked different today, smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he was trying to do. The expensive suit couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes, or the way his hands trembled slightly as he shuffled through papers. Judge Patricia Williams was a woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades listening to people justify their worst impulses. She reviewed the petition with evident skepticism. "Mr. Morse," she addressed Ethan's attorney, "your client is alleging that his father is incompetent to manage his own affairs. What specific evidence do you have to support this claim?" David Morse stood, his confidence obviously forced. "Your Honor, the respondent has been making increasingly irrational decisions. He refuses to consider reasonable living arrangements that would ensure his safety and welfare. He's isolated himself from family members who are genuinely concerned about his well-being. And he's made threats to disinherit his son based on minor family disagreements." "What kind of threats?" "He's established a trust that would transfer all his assets to charity if his family contests his decisions. This kind of vindictive action suggests impaired judgment and possible paranoia." Judge Williams looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mr. Dalton, how do you respond to these allegations?" I stood, my voice calm and clear. "Your Honor, I've made deliberate, well-considered decisions about my own life based on careful legal counsel and thorough documentation of my family's behavior. The trust was established to protect my assets from exactly this kind of challenge, one motivated by financial desperation rather than genuine concern." "You have documentation?" Margaret rose. "Extensive documentation, Your Honor. Medical evaluations, neuropsychological testing, recorded conversations, and a complete financial investigation of the petitioner's circumstances." For the next 2 hours, we presented our case methodically. Dr. Morrison testified that I was in excellent mental health for a man my age, with no signs of cognitive impairment or diminished capacity. Dr. Kovac's neuropsychological evaluation showed cognitive function in the superior range for my age group. But the most damaging evidence came from Jack Peterson's investigation. The court heard about Ethan's debts, his business failures, the Monroe's financial crisis. Margaret played selected excerpts from the dinner recordings, where their true motivations became crystal clear. Ethan's attorney tried to object, claiming the recordings violated attorney-client privilege or family privacy. Judge Williams overruled every objection with increasing irritation. "Mr. Morse, your client initiated this action claiming his father lacks capacity to make rational decisions. The recordings demonstrate not only that Mr. Dalton is thinking clearly, but that he was astute enough to document behavior that supports his own position. This is evidence of competency, not incompetency." When Ethan took the stand in his own defense, his testimony fell apart under Margaret's cross-examination. Yes, he owed substantial money to creditors. Yes, he needed housing for his in-laws but couldn't afford to provide it himself. Yes, he'd contacted real estate agents and bankers without his father's knowledge or consent. And isn't it true, Mr. Dalton, that your father's property represents your only potential source of funds to resolve your financial crisis? I wasn't thinking about it that way. How were you thinking about it? Ethan's shoulders sagged. For a moment, he looked like the boy who used to build things in my garage, before life had taught him to see people as obstacles instead of family. "I thought he'd be happier somewhere else," he said quietly. "Somewhere with people his own age, activities, medical care nearby." "Did you ask him if he'd be happier somewhere else?" We discussed it." "You discussed it, or you told him what he was going to do?" Ethan didn't answer. Judge Williams had heard enough. "I'm dismissing this petition with prejudice. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Richard Dalton is fully competent to manage his own affairs. Furthermore, this action appears to have been filed in bad faith, motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine concern for the respondent's welfare." She looked directly at Ethan. "Mr. Dalton, your father has the absolute right to live where he chooses, to dispose of his property as he sees fit, and to establish conditions for inheritance based on his own values and judgment. The court finds no evidence whatsoever that these decisions are the product of diminished capacity." Then her voice hardened. "However, the court does find that this petition was frivolous and potentially malicious. The petitioner will pay all court costs and reasonable attorney fees for the respondent. Additionally, this dismissal will be noted in the public record as a finding of bad faith." The gavel fell with finality. Ethan's shoulders shook. Whether from rage or grief, I couldn't tell. Margaret gathered our papers with quiet efficiency. That's what we call a complete victory, she said softly. But watching my son sit alone at his table while his attorney packed up in obvious haste, I wasn't sure victory was the right word. Outside the courthouse, Ethan caught up with me as I walked toward my truck. "Dad, please, can we talk? Really talk this time?" I stopped, studying his face. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "What did you want to say?" "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all of it. The dinners, the recordings, the lawyers. I was desperate, and I made terrible decisions. You were desperate for money, not for my welfare." Yes, the admission seemed to cost him something. "But I also couldn't stand watching you rattle around in that big house, surrounded by reminders of Mom. I thought if I could just get you somewhere smaller, somewhere with people." "You thought you knew better than I did about my own grief. I thought I was helping. By lying to me, by investigating my finances, by trying to have me declared incompetent." Ethan's face crumpled. "I don't know what I was thinking. I just wanted my father back. The man who used to fix everything, who always knew what to do. Instead, I got someone who seemed lost, alone, unreachable. I looked at this man who shared my name and my history, but had somehow become a stranger. The boy who had helped me in the garage was still there somewhere, buried under years of poor decisions and desperate choices. Son," I said quietly, "I was never lost. I was grieving. There's a difference. I know that now." "Do you?" "Because respect for other people's choices, even when you don't understand them. That's what separates adults from children. That's what separates family from strangers." Ethan nodded, tears running down his cheeks. "What happens now?" I thought about Caroline, about what she would want for both of us. She'd loved Ethan unconditionally, but she'd also taught him that love without boundaries wasn't really love at all. Now, you go home and figure out your own problems without trying to solve them at my expense. You learn to live within your means instead of looking for shortcuts. And maybe, if you can do those things, we can rebuild some kind of relationship. And if I can't, then you'll have learned something valuable about consequences. I climbed into my truck and drove home through countryside that looked different now, not like a place I was defending, but like a place I'd successfully defended. The battle was over, but the victory felt hollow. I'd won the right to keep my house, my independence, my dignity, but I'd lost something too, the illusion that family loyalty was unconditional, that blood relationships could survive any strain. At the lake house, I walked through each room slowly, seeing it fresh, not as a fortress under siege, but as a home where a man could live out his days on his own terms. The cameras were still there, the motion sensors still armed, but they felt different now, not like defensive measures, but like simple precautions. In Caroline's study, I opened the fireproof box one last time and added the final documents: the court's dismissal order, Judge Williams's finding that the petition was frivolous, Margaret's bill for legal services that Ethan would have to pay. Then I carried the box to the basement and stored it on the highest shelf, where it would wait in case I ever needed that documentation again. But I didn't think I would. Ethan had learned his lesson the hard way, and desperate people rarely made the same mistake twice when the consequences were severe enough. As the sun set behind the pines, I sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching the light fade from the water. Tomorrow would be different, the first day in months when I wouldn't wake up wondering what new pressure they'd try to apply, what new scheme they'd attempt. The loon called again, its voice echoing across the lake, but tonight it sounded different. Not lonely, but free. I thought about Caroline, about the life we'd built in this place, about the choice she'd made 32 years ago to grow old here. She'd been right about that, as she'd been right about so many things. "I kept our promise," I said aloud, my voice carrying across the water. "This is still our home." The phone rang as I walked back toward the house, but I didn't hurry to answer it. Whatever crisis or emergency or demand for my attention was calling could wait. I had all the time in the world now, and I intended to use it exactly as I pleased. For the first time in months, that felt like a victory worth having. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this story moved you, subscribe and share your thoughts about family, respect, and the courage it takes to stand your ground when everything you've built is on the line.